Hey there, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions. The purpose of this video is to give you an overview of the run-specific threshold boosting training plan that you've purchased from the Training Peaks training plan store. This is an 8-week plan, and for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be mostly demonstrating the plan with a beginner level 8-week run-specific training plan. But just know that this video is applicable regardless of which level plan you have. There are 3 different levels. There's beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And all of the features and what you get with the plan are pretty much the same from beginner through advanced. The only real major differences are going to be the overall weekly training volume, the duration of some of the sessions, and the intensity of the sessions will obviously be a little bit longer and higher in the intermediate and advanced level plans than, for example, the beginner one that I'm showing right here in this video. But all the plans get the exact same things. You'll have on day 1 of each of the plans an introduction note card. You'll have obviously the training sessions each week throughout the 8 weeks. And then at the very end of the plan, you'll have another note card in here for the last week. And the plan essentially starts with the first session being a run-specific threshold test, and you repeat that at the end of the session. So obviously with the goal being to improve your threshold-specific fitness on the run, we need to be able to measure that beginning and end of the plan to see if you actually made some progress. And then everything in between obviously is geared towards improving your threshold-specific fitness. So with that said, starting on day 1 of the plan, you're going to see here an introduction note card. So within this, you're going to hopefully have clicked on the link to this video first. And then once you have reviewed this video, just going over the major features of the training plan, the next thing to do is to determine your resting heart rate. So you can either do this manually, and I give instructions on how to do that first thing in the morning upon waking up. I know most people nowadays usually have some sort of wearable device, and a lot of people will wear it throughout the night as well, and it can record things such as heart rate and heart rate variability. If you have a device that you wear overnight and it captures overnight resting heart rate for you, then you can also just use like your kind of rolling 7-day average or 14-day average or month-long average resting heart rate if you prefer to just go that route as well. You'll use your resting heart rate to determine some heart rate training zones and things of that nature. And then the last thing to just take a look at in here in this introduction note card is this RPE table. If you click on this, it's going to download a PDF. Now with rating of perceived exertion or RPE, there are a variety of different ways of setting up a scale. So I prefer to use this specific scale right here that's 1 through 10. Whereas structured exercise intensities begin at an RPE of 3 and go all the way up to 10. Some people will use a 0 through 10 scale where 1 and 2 are actually prescribed RPEs. I consider an RPE of 1 and 2 to be either laying down and doing nothing, or 2 as being like activities of daily living. And then 3 is essentially where structured exercise starts. For other people, again, they'll use different RPE scales, and if this is you, if you prefer to use a different type of RPE scale, then just keep that in mind as you go throughout this plan, because I do leave rating of perceived exertion notes in the training sessions when I prescribe the running sessions based on a percentage of your threshold pace. So I usually will incorporate some sort of rating of perceived exertion associated with whatever the intensity level is of the effort. So if you want to also go off of a rating of perceived exertion to keep in the back of your mind while you're following along to the training sessions, just know that this is the specific scale I use. So if you're used to a different scale, these numbers could look a little bit different or might mean something slightly different depending on, again, which scale you use. So this is here. I would highly recommend you look at it just so you can put into context what the actual RPE numbers mean within the training sessions that I prescribe. And just to give you a quick example of what that looks like, the run-specific threshold testing is purely based on perceived exertion, because we're obviously not prescribing this based on a percentage of your threshold, because we're going to aim to determine it here. So you'll need to at least be familiar with the RPE scale that I use for the purpose of the threshold testing. So you can see there's a warm-up, and it's based on a perceived exertion scale. Obviously the 20-minute effort in the threshold testing is just a 20-minute max effort, and then you have a perceived exertion range on the cool down. And then for all the other sessions that follow, It's going to be prescribed. The intensity level or the paces that are given to you for your sessions are based on a percentage of your threshold pace that you determine in that initial threshold test. But you'll see that there's a note down below that indicates what type of effort it is, as well as a perceived exertion that should correspond with it. So you can ignore that if you, for example, prefer to use your own type of RPE scale, or you've been familiar with another one from the past, but you can also rely on the perceived exertion numbers that I provide here if you would like to use a scale that I provide in this training plan. So a little bit more on the threshold test. So there are a variety of different ways of calculating or estimating someone's threshold. I prefer to use just a 20-minute time trial since they're relatively simple to do. They're not necessarily easy, but they're simple to do. And then you just take 95% of that threshold pace. So if you are brand new to threshold testing, I highly recommend reading through this note here as I go over what threshold is. There's still a lot of misconceptions around what threshold is and like what lactate is. Some people still call it lactic acid when lactic acid doesn't really exist in the human body. It's simply just lactate, as well as like what lactate is and what actually causes fatigue when you're doing hard exercise. And then I go into more detail about your threshold in this link here. So if you're brand new to it, I would highly recommend that you review this video just to get a little bit more in-depth overview of what your threshold actually is and what we're actually trying to measure and why it's important to know it. So that's here for you if you are new to threshold testing, or if you are familiar with it but you just want to make sure that you're kind of kept up to date with exactly what it is. And then down below that, I give you the information that you need to determine your estimated functional threshold pace and threshold heart rate, as well as then how to set up training zones in your Training Peaks settings so that your training sessions are prescribed to you based on an accurate threshold and you have accurate pace zones and heart rate zones. I also provide, though, a link to an Excel spreadsheet, and within this spreadsheet, it's going to be a place to input your resting heart rate, your age, and then you'll notice if you do that, let's say your resting heart rate is 50, you'll see that your heart rate ranges are auto-populated. So I typically like to use a 5-zone model, with zone 1 being easy, zone 2 being aerobic, zone 3 being tempo, 4 threshold, and then 5 is kind of your VO2 max or interval style intensity level. And then I have corresponding RPE ranges, heart rate ranges, and then you can plug in your pace here once you figure out what your threshold pace is. So because your threshold pace is in minute per mile, you could make this minute per kilometer if you want. It's difficult for the pace that you input here to auto-populate and calculate paces over here. So what you have to do if you want to go this route is click on this link here, and then you can transfer over or translate minute per mile over to speed, and then you can translate speed in miles per hour back over to pace once you've multiplied it by these different percentages. And then you can put your pace ranges in here. And then if you do use power, which some runners use power now, there is a place here for you to put in your threshold power. So if you have that, and let's say it's 300 watts on the run, that's going to automatically auto-populate. But I do prescribe all the training sessions on pace, so a percentage of your threshold pace. So it is really useful to know like what your pace ranges are, and then you can essentially just take this chart here and like manually enter all of this into your Training Peaks settings for your zones. So in Training Peaks, there's a variety of ways to set up training zones, and if you want to keep it really simple, you can just use this Excel spreadsheet that I provide here, especially if you're newer to setting up your own training zones. If there's like very specific ways that you like to set up your training zones and you find that it works for you, obviously just take your threshold pace, your threshold heart rate, and then just use your normal training zones if you have them set up in Training Peaks, and kind of update them to be reflecting what your current threshold is. But if you're brand new to it, these training zones are a really great place to start. They're pretty generalizable across a variety of different types of athletes. There's nothing like super unique or niche about them. They're just kind of like general heart rate and pace zones that tend to work well for most athletes. But it's important that you enter training zones into Training Peaks under your personal settings. Otherwise, the prescribed paces for all of the run sessions that follow are not going to be reflective of the actual paces that you should be seeing or get suggested. And then as you progress throughout the training plan, you'll notice that if you click on each individual session and you go to follow it, there is typically going to be a description that just gives you a brief overview of what that session entails and kind of what it should feel like and what the focus is. And then you'll be able to follow these run workouts on like a watch, for example. If you can sync it with Training Peaks, you should be able to just pull these sessions up and then follow them. So for example, this one is just an easy run at 65 to 70% of your threshold pace. It's an easy recovery pace, and it should be a pretty easy RPE of 3 to 4. And you'll see that trend continued throughout the sessions, with really the only thing changing is just the type of session and the intensity level. And for most training plans, there are 4 runs a week. Some of them may have 5 runs a week, especially the advanced level plans. I tend to work mostly with triathletes, so I kind of have geared some of these threshold boosting plans around triathletes who tend to also have swim, bike, and strength training sessions to do throughout the week. So if you are a pure runner and you have been for a while, you might be used to doing more sessions per week than this, especially if you do an advanced level plan and you're more of an advanced runner. But these plans are a little bit more geared towards triathletes, so just know that if you do get one of these plans and you notice that the frequency isn't maybe as high as what you were expecting, like 5 or 6 runs per week, it is because that they are geared a little bit more towards triathletes. It doesn't mean that if you're a pure runner, you couldn't use one of these plans. You can obviously incorporate this into your own training if you're just a standalone runner. If you feel like you really need to have additional run sessions per week, you can obviously add like maybe 1 or 2 other run sessions that are just kind of short and easy if you really prefer to have more frequency. But in general, throughout the course of this plan, it should be a sufficient frequency and volume as long as you pick the right level specific to you that allows you to improve your threshold over the course of the plan. And then again, you'll just follow this week to week, and then once you get to the final week, you'll notice that there's a note card in here just going over just a really quick overview of what to expect in your final week, where you kind of recover leading up to your second run specific threshold test. So one other note on the threshold testing is whatever you decide to do for your threshold testing, whether it be inside on a treadmill or outdoors, you want to try and replicate what you did in the beginning and do the exact same thing at the end of the plan. So for example, if you do this outside, you want to make sure that you do it outside again for the second time you retest. And then also, if you can, try and replicate like the same time of day, the same environmental conditions if possible. So indoors obviously makes it really easy to do that because it's pretty much the same indoors no matter what time of day you go, and even if the weather changes outside, assuming you are doing it in the same place and it isn't dramatically cooler or hotter in one gym versus another gym. But the point is to retest this 8 weeks later. You want to make sure that you are essentially replicating the environment that you did the first test in. You also want to try and make sure that you pick a relatively flat route and try and avoid doing it outside during a time of day when it is incredibly windy. If it is a windy day outside, make sure that it's set up in a way where you're running into the wind and with the wind for equal amounts of time. You just want to try and make sure that you're not setting yourself up to have environmental conditions significantly affect the outcome of your threshold pace. And if that does happen to be the case when you do the threshold testing in the beginning of the training plan, like for example, if you do it outside in the evening and it tends to be really warm out, if you're doing this in the summer, just make sure you do it outside again in the evening, and hopefully it's warm enough that the conditions are relatively the same. But if you're, for example, doing this and you're coming out of winter and you're starting this and you know that 8 weeks from now it's going to be a lot warmer potentially than it is when you started this 8-week plan, it might be smart, honestly, to do this on the treadmill. And then that way you can replicate it again in 8 weeks, do it on the treadmill, and you know that there aren't environmental conditions that are significantly impacting your threshold results. So with that said, this is essentially what to expect with these run-specific threshold boosting training plans. If you ever have any questions throughout the plan as you're following along to it, you can always reach out to me via my email. It is peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com, and you should be able to find my contact information if you go back to the Training Peaks Training Plan store or library and look under my coaching profile. I should have my contact information listed in there.